The world had shrunk to the smell of cordite and frozen mud. For 19-year-old Gefreiter Klaus Richter, the universe was the Ardennes forest in the winter of 1944. It was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the frost that clung to his eyelashes, and the constant thrumming terror of artillery that had become the metronome of his life. Klaus and his unit were the tattered remnants of the great German offensive. The dream of a swift victory had frozen and died in the Belgian snow. Now survival was measured in minutes. The propaganda posters back home had shown them as heroic figures, pushing back the decadent, weak-willed Americans. The reality was starvation, frostbite, and the dawning, terrifying realization that they had lost. The air itself seemed to crackle with a new sound. Not the familiar German stutter of the MG-42, but a deeper, more confident rhythm, the American M1 Garand. Then the silhouettes appeared through the trees. Tall, well-fed, and armed with weapons that did not jam in the cold. Klaus's rifle fell from his numb fingers. He dropped to his knees, his mind racing through every horror story he had been told. The Americans, their propaganda minister had screamed, were gangsters and savages. They took no prisoners. They were agents of a vengeful world, eager to inflict every cruelty imaginable. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the cold shock of a bayonet or the final, deafening crack of a pistol. It did not come. A hand, covered in a wool glove, roughly patted him down. Another soldier offered him something. Not a weapon. Not a fist. A cigarette. An American Lucky Strike. Klaus stared at it, bewildered. The American soldier just grunted. "You are done, Kraut. The war is over for you." This was the first crack in the foundation of his reality. It would not be the last. Klaus Richter, along with nearly 400,000 other German prisoners of war, was about to embark on an impossible journey. They were being shipped across the Atlantic, to the belly of the beast itself, America. The voyage was a purgatory of rumor and dread. In the cramped, foul-smelling hold of the ship, whispers circulated. They were being taken to America to be used as slave labor, to be starved and worked to death. Others whispered they would be subjects of medical experiments. The most terrifying rumor was that they would be handed over to the Russians. For Klaus, hunger was a familiar companion. But this was a new kind of emptiness, the dread of the unknown. This journey would take him thousands of miles, from everything he knew. If you are just joining us, let us know where in the world you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about history. When they docked in New York, the sheer scale of the country was an assault on their senses. The buildings were not bombed-out husks. They were gleaming towers that scraped the sky. The people on the streets were not gaunt and dressed in rags. They were well-clothed, their faces full. There were cars. So many cars. They were loaded onto a train, bound for a camp deep in the American heartland. This, they thought, is where the real nightmare begins. The train rumbled for days, a steel cage moving through an impossible landscape of abundance. They finally arrived at a destination in the middle of nowhere. A series of wooden barracks surrounded by tall fences and barbed wire. Guard towers stood like skeletal sentinels at each corner. This was it, the end of the line. The prisoners were marched off the train and into a processing building. They braced for the worst. But the torture they had dreaded came in the most unexpected form. First, it was the hot shower. Not a cold hose down, but an unbelievable luxury. Soap and unlimited hot water, washing away years of filth from the trenches of the Eastern Front and the forests of Belgium. It felt like a baptism and an execution all at once. Then they were led to the mess hall. They expected a bowl of thin soup, a crust of hard bread. Instead, the air was thick, with the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee. They were handed trays piled high with scrambled eggs, thick slices of white bread with butter, and a strange, delicious paste the Americans called peanut butter. Klaus ate in a stunned silence. He watched his comrades. Men who had killed and starved and marched across a continent now sat frozen, staring at their plates. This was more food than they had seen in a year. The words of the Geneva Convention, read to them by a bored American captain, meant nothing. The reality on the plate in front of them meant everything. Later, they were shown to their barracks. There were no lice-infested straw heaps. Just rows of clean cots, each with a mattress and 2 thick wool blankets. That night, no one spoke. They lay on their soft beds, their stomachs full for the first time in memory, and listened to the silence of the American plains. The comfort was more terrifying than any threat. The kindness was more disorienting than any cruelty. This was not what they were promised. This was not how you treated a hated enemy. It had to be a trick, a lie, a prelude to something far worse. They were being fattened like pigs for slaughter. They had to be. Because if this was real, then everything they had fought for, everything they had believed, was a lie. The days bled into one another, each marked by the same disorienting routine: wake up in a soft bed, eat a breakfast that would have been a feast on the front lines. Then, work. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners could be made to work, and America, with its men overseas, had a labor shortage. Klaus and the others were loaded onto trucks and driven out past the barbed wire, into the vast, open fields of the American countryside. They picked cotton under the Texas sun, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and cut timber in Wisconsin. They worked alongside American farmers, old men and young women whose husbands and sons were fighting in Europe. At first, there was a tense silence, a gulf of suspicion and language. But the sun is the same in any language. Thirst is universal. A farmer's wife would bring out a pitcher of lemonade, sweating in the heat. She would offer a glass to a guard, and then, hesitantly, to the prisoners. The first time it happened, the men froze. Was it poisoned? Was it a test? One man, desperate with thirst, finally took a glass and drank. Nothing happened. It was just cold, sweet lemonade. Soon, these small gestures became normal. They revealed a simple, devastating truth. These people did not seem to hate them. They saw them not as monsters, but as farmhands. The real psychological warfare was waged not with weapons, but with calories. Red Cross inspectors visited the camps regularly. Their reports, now declassified, are clinical and stunning. They noted the prisoners were receiving a daily diet of over 3,000 calories. Back in Germany, civilian rations had fallen below 1,500. A German soldier on the front was lucky to get 2,000. Here, in captivity, they were eating better than their own guards, whose rations were sometimes smaller to support the war effort. And they were introduced to the strange talismans of American life. Peanut butter was a source of endless confusion and debate. Some thought it was a type of shoe polish. Others believed it was axle grease. But it was delicious, and it was on their bread every day. They were paid 80 cents a day in camp scripens, a currency that only worked inside the wire. With it, they could buy wonders at the camp canteen. They would hold the curved, cold glass of a Coca-Cola bottle like it was a holy relic. The sweet, dark liquid was the taste of a world they could not comprehend. In the evenings, they heard alien sounds drifting from the guards, radios, the chaotic, joyful noise of jazz music, the strange, rhythmic chant of a baseball announcer describing a game they could not picture. They were prisoners on another planet. But the old world followed them. Mail from home, when it arrived, was a double-edged sword. Letters were heavily censored, but the desperation bled through the black ink. Klaus received a letter from his mother in Stuttgart. She spoke of the constant air raids, the nights spent in the cellar. She wrote of their meager rations of potatoes and bread made with sawdust. Then came the sentence that shattered him. "I pray you are safe and warm. We hear the Americans are correct people. It is surely better where you are." He read the words again and again. His mother, a free German citizen, was praying for the well-being of her son, a prisoner of war, because his prison was safer than her home. The abundance around him suddenly felt like a crime. The food in his belly turned to lead. If this story is surprising you, and you believe history is more complex than we are often told, take a moment to subscribe. You will not want to miss how this ends. The letter changed everything. The guilt, which had been a dull ache, became a sharp, constant pain. A divide grew within the camp. Some prisoners, the die-hard believers, saw the kindness as a trick. They tried to maintain military discipline, holding secret courts for those who grew too friendly with the Americans. They whispered that Germany's secret weapons would soon turn the tide. They clung to the honor of the uniform, even as it was replaced by denim work clothes stamped with a large P and W. But for Klaus and many others, the foundation had crumbled. How could you maintain your hatred for an enemy who fed you, clothed you, and whose children offered you chocolate? How could you fight for a fatherland that was starving your family while you gained weight in a foreign land? The propaganda posters had shown them as wolves, and the Americans as decadent sheep. But here, the wolves were being fed by the sheep, and the sheep were impossibly, terrifyingly strong. The sheer number of trucks, the endless freight trains, the quality of every tool and every uniform spoke of an industrial might that Germany could never match. They had not been fighting a nation, they had been fighting a factory. One evening, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. It was a news broadcast in German, a service provided by the camp authorities. The voice announced that the city of Dresden had been firebombed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were dead. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the barracks. Men who had faced death without flinching now wept quietly in their bunks. These were their cities, their people. Their home was a funeral pyre. Later that night, the scheduled entertainment went on as planned. A projector whirred to life, throwing a flickering image onto a sheet hung in the mess hall. It was an American comedy, a Charlie Chaplin film. And soon, a strange sound filled the hall. It started as a few hesitant chuckles, then grew. It was the sound of hundreds of German prisoners of war, their bellies full of American food, laughing in the dark while their country burned to the ground, thousands of miles away. The laughter died in their throats as the film ended. The silence that followed was heavier than any artillery barrage. That night, the American re-education program began in earnest. It was not a program of gentle persuasion. It was an autopsy of a lie, and they were forced to watch. They were herded back into the mess hall, but the screen was not filled with comedians or cowboys. The projector whirred, and the images that flickered to life were from another world. A world of walking skeletons in striped pajamas, of skeletal hands reaching through barbed wire. The camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The camera did not flinch. It panned over mountains of emaciated bodies, bulldozed into mass graves. It showed the ovens, still holding the ashes of human beings. The prisoners watched in stunned, horrified silence. Some men vomited. Others sobbed uncontrollably. A few die-hard officers stood up and shouted that it was all fake, clever American propaganda. But they were shouted down by their own comrades. The faces of the dead were German faces. The locations were German towns they knew. The horror was undeniable. This was the dark heart of the fatherland they had been fighting to protect. The psychological assault continued, shifting from emotional horror to cold, hard logic. They were given lectures, presented with charts and graphs. An American officer, speaking through a translator, laid out the numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States had produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany had produced less than half that. America had launched thousands of ships, millions of tons of steel, while German ports were rubble. They were shown pictures of Detroit's factories, endless assembly lines churning out tanks and jeeps at a rate that was simply impossible to comprehend. The war was not a matter of spirit or will, as they had been told. It was a matter of arithmetic. And they had been on the wrong side of the equation from the very beginning. The myth of their invincibility, the core of their identity as soldiers, was crushed under a mountain of statistics. The final blow came through the mail. The letters from home grew more desperate. Klaus received another letter from his mother. The block of censored text was larger this time, but the words that remained were sharp as glass. His younger cousin, only 15, had been taken from school and sent to the front with a Panzerfaust and 2 days of rations. His grandfather had died of malnutrition. The winter of 1945 was a season of starvation. She ended with a simple, devastating plea. Do not try to come home yet. Stay where you are. There is nothing left here but ghosts. His captors were keeping him alive. His own country was devouring its children. The paradox was complete. It was a poison that seeped into the soul. The camp became a quiet asylum of despair. Men would stare at the barbed wire for hours, their eyes empty. Suicide attempts became more common. A man from Hamburg, who learned his entire family had been killed in the firestorm, hanged himself in the latrine with his own belt. Honor was a word no one spoke anymore. It had been replaced by a hollow, aching shame. Klaus felt himself breaking. One afternoon, working in the fields, he simply collapsed, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of it all. He lay in the dirt, the American sun beating down on him, and he wished for the cold of the Ardennes. He wished for the shell that had missed him. Death on the battlefield felt clean, honorable. This slow death of the spirit was a special kind of hell. An American guard walked over, nudging him with his boot. "Get up, Richter." Klaus did not move. He just lay there, waiting. For a bullet. For a kick. For anything to end it. The guard sighed. He knelt, uncapped his canteen, and poured a little water on Klaus's face. "The war is almost over, kid," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Just hold on. You get to go home." Go home, the words echoed in his mind. Home to what? To a pile of rubble where his house used to be? To a mother who was afraid of his return? What was he holding on for? That night, an announcement came over the camp's loudspeakers. The war in Europe was over. A strange, muted wave of something that was not quite relief and not quite joy passed through the barracks. They were survivors. But the announcement was not finished. The voice continued, explaining that the repatriation process would begin soon. However, due to agreements made at the Yalta Conference, all prisoners captured on the Eastern Front might be subject to transfer to Soviet custody. A cold dread, deeper than any he had ever known, gripped Klaus. He had been captured in the West by the Americans, but his unit had been transferred from Russia just before the offensive. His papers, his entire military record, screamed Eastern Front. He was not going home. He was being sent to the Gulag. The air in the barracks grew thick with a new kind of terror. The Eastern Front. The Gulag. For Klaus, the food in his belly turned to ice. For days, he waited for his name to be called. He saw other men he knew from the Russian campaign, marched away to a separate part of the camp, their faces pale with resignation. He watched them go, certain his turn was next. The kindness of the Americans had been a brief, warm interlude before the final, cold darkness. Then, one morning, a guard handed him a slip of paper. Repatriation Group West, a bureaucratic error, a moment of mercy. He never knew which. The officer who processed his papers had likely just glanced at the top sheet, which read Ardennes, and ignored the detailed history beneath. A signature, a stamp, and his fate was sealed. He was going home. The journey back across the Atlantic was the inverse of the first. The ship was not filled with the dread of the unknown, but the shame of the known. These men were no longer soldiers. They were survivors returning to a graveyard. They carried with them the images from the camp newsreels, the mountains of bodies, the hollow eyes of the dead. They carried the knowledge of their country's monstrous crime, a weight far heavier than any rifle or pack. Klaus landed in Bremerhaven in 1946. He stepped onto German soil and did not recognize it. The air smelled of damp coal and decay. The cities were not cities anymore. There were skeletons of buildings, jagged teeth against a gray sky. He saw the women, the Trümmerfrauen, clearing rubble with their bare hands, their faces etched with a grim resolve he had never seen in battle. He found his mother in a crowded basement apartment in Stuttgart. She was thin, her hair was white, and she looked 20 years older. When she saw him, she cried, but they were not tears of joy, they were tears of exhaustion. He stood before her, healthy, his face fuller than when he had left, wearing a decent coat provided by the Americans. He felt like an alien, a traitor. He had survived, even thrived, while his world had burned. For the rest of his life, Klaus Richter rarely spoke of the war. He worked, he married, he helped rebuild his shattered country. He became a part of Germany's economic miracle. But a silence surrounded his time in America. How could he tell his neighbors, who had lost children to starvation, that he had debated the merits of peanut butter? How could he explain to his wife, who had spent nights huddled in air raid shelters, that he had watched Hollywood movies and listened to jazz music? His good treatment felt like a dirty secret, a betrayal of their shared suffering. The kindness he had been shown was a wall between him and his own people. Decades later, an old man, he sat on a park bench with his young granddaughter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bar of chocolate, handing it to her. He watched her tear the wrapper, her face bright with a simple joy he could barely comprehend. He had been trained to face bullets, to endure cold, to die for an idea. The Nazi propaganda had prepared him for an enemy's cruelty. It had given him no defense against an enemy's mercy. He had survived the battlefields of the Ardennes, but a part of his soul had been conquered in a prison camp in Texas, not by a weapon, but by a full plate of food and a clean bed. In the end, the most profound shock of the war was not the sting of defeat. It was the bewildering, disorienting, and lifelong burden of being treated with humanity by the very people he was supposed to hate. If this story made you reconsider the simple narratives of war, please like this video and subscribe for more hidden histories. What part of this story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.